everyone, grab your coffee and let's get moving because we still have a lot of ground to cover. If you think we've talked a lot about mineral wool, guess what? We're not even at our halfway mark yet. There's so much more I need to share with you. So I want you to find a comfortable spot and settle in because in this Firestop Coffee Break training, we're going to keep going with our story. In this segment, I want to explain why Robert's plan of increasing the density of the mineral wool doesn't fix the compression problem that he had. You probably remember that we said that he needed to use 8 inches of 4 PCF mineral wool in a 4-inch joint in order to achieve the 50% compression requirements of the Firestop system that he was working with. Robert thought that the increased compression was required to improve the fire performance and the ability of the assembly to stop the movement of fire, smoke, and toxic gases. Well, that's completely accurate. But what's important to understand is where his logic failed him when he connected the dots between the compression and the density. He assumed that the 4 PCF density mineral wool would double in density when he compressed it 50%. And when you look at it that way, you might be able to come to the same conclusion, but be careful or else you'll make the same mistake as Robert. He assumed that meant that he could use 8 PCF mineral wool without any compression and that it would be equivalent to 4 PCF mineral wool with the 50% compression, and it doesn't work that way. And there are 2 reasons that this installation doesn't conform with the requirements. Let's go over the easy one first. For that, we have to look at the Firestop detail. You'll see here the detail says a minimum 4 PCF. Then it says 50% compression. So technically that means that you could use 6 PCF or even 8 PCF mineral wool and still comply with the requirements of the Firestop detail. But you would still need to get 50% compression. I've never seen a Firestop detail that allows an option to use a different density and to reduce the compression requirements. So be careful with that line of thinking. That brings us back to the reason that you need compression in the first place. But remember, if you don't want to get super technical with your field evaluations, you can just use this as the reason. The installation simply doesn't conform with the documentation. In other words, your field work doesn't match your paperwork. But what I really want is for you to understand why this is so important. And for that, we need to talk about the role of compression in your Firestop installations. We said that Robert thought that the increased compression was required to improve the fire performance and the ability of the assembly to stop the movement of fire, smoke, and toxic gases. While that really is a critical role of the mineral wool in fire protection applications, it's not where our story stops. The key piece of information that Robert was missing is this. The compression is required to allow the joint to be subject to movement and still remain resilient. But also, the compression helps the Firestop remain in place. The same way that the orientation is critical, as we discussed earlier, so too is the compression. In fact, they are quite intrinsically linked. And that will be one of the red flags that we'll discuss later. If you look at fire-rated joints, a lot of them will require mineral wool. So you just shove it in the hole and you're good, right? That's what a lot of installers do. But at this point, it's clear it's not that easy. It's important that you know that 50% compression is not always required in fire-rated joints. In my experience, I tend to see higher compression requirements when you have larger joints, or particularly when you're looking at engineering judgments. Engineering judgments are used when there's no tested and listed system for the field condition that an installer wants to use a material for. The manufacturers want assurance that things will stay in place the way they expect them to, so they may require 50% compression. When you see either of these 2 conditions, please take a second look at the compression requirements of your Firestop detail or your engineering judgment, just so that you know what you're dealing with. I also want you to know that mineral wool is not always required in fire-rated joints. So, how do you know when you need mineral wool and when you don't? That's easy. It's the same way that you know how much mineral wool, what compression is required, how much Firestop spray or sealant is required. The answer to all of these questions will be found in your tested and listed Firestop detail. Hopefully, you're starting to get the picture of how important each of these little elements actually is. Maybe you haven't historically been using the paperwork when you review your field installations. Hopefully you will now. If you want to be really good, you'll use your paperwork to lay out a construction plan that will incorporate Firestop in some of your early planning discussion. We'll help you with how to do that in this and other training programs. For example, smaller joints may allow for the use of backer rod if you're installing Firestop sealant in head of wall joints. For gypsum walls, they may allow for just sealant. But please remember, when you use Firestop spray, you always have to use mineral wool. And when you're dealing with larger joints, you'll always need mineral wool. But more than that, suddenly all of these little things that we're talking about become absolutely critical to the fire performance of the systems that need it to be installed. Before we dive into this, please remember that we're keeping these Firestop coffee break trainings short for a few reasons. First, so that you can review exactly what you need if you want to refresh your memory later. 2, so that you can fit these trainings into your hectic schedule without blocking out large chunks of time. 3, they're easy to share with the people that you work with who don't know what you now know. Most Firestop details for through penetrations, as well as fire-rated joints, will call for a minimum 4 PCF density mineral wool. You may know that mineral wool comes in 2.5, 4, 6, and 8 pound densities. The 2.5 pound is light and fluffy, and you may see this on wood frame buildings where the roofers are using lightweight insulation, but you may also see it used for interior walls for acoustical insulation. It's important that you know that 2 or 2.5 pound density mineral wool is not acceptable material for Firestop installations. Remember, your Firestop details will require mineral wool. It'll almost always call for a minimum of 4 PCF density mineral wool. But for now, I want you to know that the different mineral wool products are tested to different standard. Even the material with the same density, they may have different performance characteristics because they're actually made differently. Please remember, if a material has not been tested to the required standard, then it's not the right material to use. That means that you need to check the paperwork to be sure that the material is appropriate for the application you want to use it in, and then you have to be sure that the submitted material is actually what's being used in the field. This is important, and we're going to dedicate a fair bit of time to helping you understand exactly how to do this. We'll walk you through an actual comparison, but this is often overlooked, and it's important, so it'll be worth hearing more than once. We'll get into that in some of the videos that follow. For now, I'm sure you're wondering what happened to Robert, and how did we solve his problem? Understandably, he was frustrated because he needed to install the Firestop properly. Not just because I was a thorn in his side, but he honestly wanted to do this right. And he was struggling with getting 8 inches of mineral wool into that slot. He now knew that 8 PCF mineral wool was not going to work. So I spent a few hours on my hands and knees beside Robert installing mineral wool and trying to figure out a better way so that he could hit his production numbers. And here's what I learned, in case it ever serves you like it has me. Remember, we're talking about 2 pieces of mineral wool that are 4 inch by 4 inch and trying to slide them into an opening after we've compressed it 50%. The mineral wool was flimsy and it wouldn't stay where we wanted it to. So we thought if it was flimsy, maybe some more bulk would help. So we started to cut the pieces 4 inch by 6 inch, and that extra length into the opening reduced the flimsiness of the mineral wool. So after a few shots of playing around with the longer pieces, we were able to get the lineal footage that his boss needed, and the extra mineral wool that they used wasn't a big deal. We're almost done, but I want to recap the takeaways from this discussion. Mineral wool is probably the least expensive but most important component of a Firestop system when it's required. If you were to compare Firestop details, you might notice that when the mineral wool depth is increased, the sealant depth can often be reduced. So if you have a Firestop detail that requires less than a ½ inch of sealant, please take a closer look at the mineral wool installation. If you're dealing with penetrations, the rules will be a little bit different. But we want to stick to Firestop in rated joints for this discussion. What I want you to remember is that when mineral wool is required in fire-rated joints, the proper installation and the proper material is critical to the performance. Remember, you need to use the right material, follow the right installation procedures. That means the right product that's been tested for that particular application. But it also means the right field installation, which includes using the proper density, installing it with the right orientation, depth, and calculating the proper compression. That's a fairly long list, but it isn't everything, which is why we have some more training for you. When we get to the video on red flags, we'll tie everything back together for you and talk about how all of these different elements of mineral wool installation may impact the fire dynamics of your field installation. During our next coffee break, however, I want to help you understand why this is so important. That, my friends, brings us to the end of this story and to the end of this coffee break. Before we leave, I want to give a quick shout out to Robert, just in case he ever gets to see this video. Yata hey, my friend. I hope you're doing well. I'll see you on your next coffee break.